I always tell my students that practice more than 4 or 5 hours that they're practicing too much. If you don't know what's wrong, you can't fix it by just repeating it again. There's a lot of technique in the left hand, but this is where the art is.
Welcome to the Bulletproof Musician Podcast, where you'll learn how to practice more effectively and perform better under pressure with insights from expert musicians and the latest research in performance psychology.
So I understand that you didn't like practicing so much as a child, and I love that because I find it really relatable, and I think it's one of the things that often not just students, but especially I think parents stress out about. My kid is so talented, but they don't seem to want to practice. What do I do? What have I done wrong? What's going on? What's going to happen? I mean, there's a lot of, I think, anxiety around that amongst everybody involved. And so I'm curious when that changed and maybe even like how that changed.
I'm not sure it changed that much. I do enjoy practicing now because I have a little bit more time. I mean, I'm cutting back on my teaching. So while I had a lot of students, I didn't really have a lot of time to practice. And now I sort of missed it. So now I'm enjoying it a little bit more. But I've never been a big fan of practicing, but I'm a big fan of music. And so it's just what goes with it. And for me, being solid on the instrument allows one to express themselves in music so much more effectively. So practicing is a necessary evil, and I do sort of enjoy it now, but I accepted it. But I must say that when I was young and growing up in our household, which was filled with musicians, both my parents and, of course, my sister, who's fabulous, I did have regular fights with my mother about practicing, and she just forced me, and we had some really tough moments. And I've when I finally left home and I went to Juilliard, I was so grateful that she did that for me. I'm not sure I could do it to a child myself, and I understand, parents struggle with it, but in my case, I had no choice. So, that would I mean, I suppose if I had insisted on quitting altogether, that might have worked, but I didn't have any choice, and I thought of all kinds of gimmicks to get out of practicing. I'll just share one with you, which is kind of horrifying, which was, I was probably maybe 7 or 8 years old, and, I had probably a half-size violin, and I looked inside, and there was this piece of wood in there, and I thought, I wonder what that is. And I took a pencil, and I stuck it in the F-hole, and I knocked it over the post. And then this was on a Friday, so I was smart then, but I tried it again later, and it was not good. But I took the violin to my mother, and I was shaking, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, what's going on there? I think something's inside." And she looked inside, and she was like, "Oh my God, your sound pulse fell down. We're gonna have to get it fixed, and it's Friday. We won't be able to go till Monday, and this is horrible, and you can't play." And I was like, "Oh, that's too bad." And then when I tried it again, I got into big trouble. So I did, and I tried all the other things. I turned my clock forward, or the clocks in the house forward, and all sorts of things. But I'm glad they didn't work, and I'm glad my mother made me practice. I might add one more thing to that, which is I'm a big fan of efficient practicing, and I always tell my students that practice more than 4 or 5 hours that they're practicing too much. Because I think if you use your brain while you're practicing, it doesn't last for 8 hours. It just doesn't. And then you're just reinforcing bad habits. So I would much prefer 4 hours of smart practicing than 8 hours of just repeating by rote. So I did learn that as a kid because I didn't like practicing and I just wanted to get it done. So I tried to figure out the most smart, the most efficient ways of practicing. And then I would put my music on my stand, facing the door, and then I'd put a 17 magazine or something in front, which I would be reading, and I would just play because I had learned my piece. So if they walked in, they would see, Bach or whatever. So I think I don't know, that started early. But I'm also a big believer now in efficient and intelligent practicing.
I wonder, and I know it's a big question, but I wonder if I could have you elaborate a little bit on that because, for me at least, one of the things that I think often is difficult when we're younger is we don't really know what practicing means other than just repeat it a bunch of times until it seems to sound better. But once you start learning how to practice effectively, it does, I think, become a little more engrossing and feels more worthwhile and it's more gratifying and so forth. But I wonder if you could paint a picture perhaps of what that started to look like, or maybe even what that looks like now for you, and how it is that you help your students understand how to do more of the sort of smart, effective, efficient practice.
Sure, of course. Um, well, we all know, and Itzhak has a cute video of explaining what how important slow practicing is, and of course, um, that's the first thing, practicing slowly. But when I was age 13 to 15, I studied with Mischa Mischakoff, who was the concertmaster under Toscanini of the NBC Symphony. He was a very strict teacher, extremely strict. You know, if you cried in your lesson, it was, he would say something like, "Good, all my students should cry in their lessons." And he was, you know, you would walk in, he was charming and would help you rosin your bow and take your violin out, and then as soon as the lesson started, and he had the word think all over the studio. And there was a huge sign, think, right on the stand at the top of the stand. So when you looked at your music, that's what you saw. And I think that that's one of the most important things is uh, okay, let's say you play something and something's wrong with it. If you don't know what's wrong, you can't fix it by just repeating it again. So you have to stop. And if you can't figure out what's wrong, you try it again. But if it's out of tune, it's not enough that it's out of tune to repeat it. You have to figure out if it was low, if it was high, and vow never to make that same mistake again. The trouble with a lot of kids these days is they just keep repeating because they think practicing a lot is the answer. And if you just repeat, then you're just solidifying what you already did incorrectly. So you have to stop and you have to think. And it's not enough to think it's out of tune. It has to be this note was high, this note was low. And then tomorrow, I'm not going to make that mistake. And I'm never going to make that mistake again. And I do have a lot of markings in my music. I used to have even more, but if if I'm if I'm hitting something out of tune and it's always low, I put an H on top of that note. And that's and if you do that early in learning a piece, then that H and that note always go together. So you can aim for the right direction the next time. So it's not enough. I mean, everybody knows it's not enough to repeat, but you have to analyze what was wrong, how to fix it, and vow never to do it that way again. It sounds simple to me.
I know it does, yet it's so hard to actually do it, and we're very
Yeah.
tempted to just kind of throw repetitions at the problem
Yeah.
without identifying what it is. What other sorts of, because I remember one of my teachers, Stephen Clapp, used to have almost like you needed like a legend to find out what all the abbreviations and the markings
Uh-huh.
meant, and like save bow, use bow, and so forth. What other sorts of symbols or markings or things do you find yourself putting into your music?
Well, I do believe that there's a lot of technique in the left hand, but this is where the art is. For me, this is where the music is. So I'm a big believer in being creative with bow distribution. So I have a lot of LH for lower half, mid is for middle, UH for upper half. And I believe in using the bow not back and forth, which I was taught by one teacher, just equally back and forth, but to, I'm a big believer in this kind of zigzag. I don't know if you can see what I'm trying to do, but if you're using the bow this way and you come back this way and then you eventually get here so that you're not just you're actually thinking about how to shape the music with your bow. So I do have a lot of bow markings in my music, and it helps me. Like, let's say, for instance, I don't know how technical you get on these things, but let's say you're trying to follow a composer's marking and they have a long slur and then one or two notes in a slur. And inevitably, that sticks out, right? So you have this long slur, and then you have to get back for another long slur, but you have only one or two beats to do it. Well, it seems obvious that you should play lightly on that one or two beats, but that's not enough. My main teacher in my life was Oscar Shumsky, is the greatest violinist and musician. And he used to call, if you made a phrasing with your bow, he used to call it accidental phrasing. And of course, that was a cardinal sin, to let your bow decide how the music goes. And so I'm constantly telling my students, you tell your bow how you want this phrase to go. Do you want it to go like this? Ta da da do do, ta da ta dee da. Is that the way you want? Is that what you hear in your head? And they're like, no, of course I don't. Well, well, why are you letting your bow decide how the music goes? Anyway, so I do have those kinds of markings. I have a lot of L's and H's for my uh, intonation. I have a lot of SB for save bow. And in chamber music, I do a lot of cues, not necessarily with notes, but just with rhythms. So I have little markings for first what I need to watch out for in another instrument. And then I also have a lot of with V2, violin 2, or with viola or that kind of thing. So in chamber music, I have more of those kinds of markings.
I don't know where I read this. I feel like when I was a little kid, I must have read an interview with like Aunt Sophie Mutter or something like that. And she said something about how it's easier to learn left hand technique stuff, but it's like the bow control that really differentiates
Mhm.
artists and people. And I always kind of remembered that. And so this is interesting for me to hear in terms of how much you think about what you do with the right arm.
Mhm.
Do you have any, I mean, is that something you just are intentional about and pay attention to when you're practicing anything, or are there specific exercises or drills or things that you've used along the years to improve that particular part of your playing?
That's a good question because I'm a big believer in Rode caprices. And so I still to this day, and I don't know if you're supposed to say road or Rode, but anyway, I grew up saying Rode. So, and it's amazing to me. I will get a student and I will say, "Did you do the Rode caprices?" And if they say they did, and I feel like they need to do it again, I said, "Well, you didn't learn enough. So let's do it again." So all those slow introductions of those rhotic caprices have a lot of what we've been talking about with this bow distribution. So my rhote is always at hand. And I will, if for instance, I'm trying to get back into shape now after having not played for a while. And because I have some concerts here in Santa Fe coming up. So I will look at what I'm going to practice. I will look at what key it's in. I'll find that rhote caprice and I will practice that and warm up with it. And I think the bow distribution thing, uh that's a great set of caprices for that because he has some, and don't change the bowings. Do the bowings as they're marked. Um he has some really long slurs and then some short slurs, and that's really handy. So I would say probably wrote it, but you could make up your own exercises just with scales by playing 6 notes and then 2, or 2 and then 6. Also, I think it's really useful to play, to practice without vibrato, because then you get the idea of what it really sounds like, and if it sounds bad, that means you're not thinking about how to use your bow, and you're not putting enough, emphasis on the beauty of the music in the right hand. So, I would say practicing without vibrato is really, really valuable. I think we it's like pianists, they hide behind the pedal. They have the lead right foot, and they put it down, and it just sounds like a big wash because they're hiding. And instead of making legato in their fingers, like I always thought you should, like I learned from playing for years with Pete Serkin, instead of doing legato in your fingers, they depend on the foot, which and in our string playing, we depend on vibrato by hiding behind vibrato. When something's a little out of tune or it's not beautiful, you just add a lot of vibrato. So that's another tool, is to practice without any vibrato and just try to make the most beautiful phrase possible.
It's interesting because the way that you're describing how you approach technique, and so far we've just been talking about bow stuff, but it sounds like it's inextricably tied to whatever musical concept you might have or intention you have for any particular moment. And it would be difficult to practice just bow stuff in isolation of whatever it is that you're trying to do with the phrase. I mean, am I kind of getting that correctly? And B, if so, how does one, because I think having a musical concept seems like an obvious thing to do, but it's easier said than done. We have to understand what we're looking for. And so how do you balance those things, or how do you help people get better at seeing what's in the score and trying to make sense of what they see there?
I must say, it's interesting. I have a couple of students that I'm trying to work on their sound. And sometimes I feel like I'm really bad at teaching sound, because if they don't have it in their ear, if they don't have it in their gut, it's really hard to give them the tools to get it. So, I can say some technical things that will produce a better sound, but I sometimes feel very inadequate, in that area. I had this one student, just a dear. I loved her. Her name is. She plays in the symphony, and I just kept saying, your sound. You've got to have a better sound. Try this, try that. And one week after her previous lesson, I had gotten frustrated, and she came in, and the sound was just beautiful, just amazing. And I said, "What happened? How did you do this?" And she said, "Well, you yelled at me last week." And I was like, "Oh my God, I got to yell at everybody." But of course, it doesn't work that way because a lot of students don't respond to that. But it's like each student has to have a trigger. You have to find the trigger. And sometimes it takes me a while to find that that point, or those points that will help them to develop. Sometimes I tell them to listen to some artists that I think have beautiful sounds, just to, I don't really like the idea of them imitating another player. But for instance, I mean, Pincus has a great sound. So watch videos of Pincus, listen to his sound. My favorite growing up, everybody loved Heifetz, and I loved and admired Heifetz, but my favorite was Oistrakh. And I just felt like when I listened to Oistrakh, I felt like he just enveloped me with his sound. I just felt so like uh, just taken care of as a listener. And so that was a big influence on me. But there are a lot of people out there now that have great sounds, and Pincus is certainly one of them. Chomsky, of course, had an amazing sound, and I heard that sound every week, and so that was also a big influence.
So I have a question about balancing technique and music. I remember someone asked Leon Fleischer this question, and his response was, you only, like, basically the question was, how much time do you need to spend working on technique? And he wasn't unkind in his answer, but sort of made it seem like it was the most obvious thing to say in the world. It's like, well, you only need as much time to work on technique as you need to say what it is that you're trying to say, or something along those lines. And I'm wondering for you, how do you, and this goes back to this question of, what do we do in the 4 or 5 hours that we have to practice? I mean, how do you balance time spent on fundamentals or technique or the caprices and the other stuff that's on your list to do?
Well, it's different for every student, and that's why that's the way I teach is you have these raw materials in a student, and it's my job to make them a better version of that, of who they are. So my biggest compliment as a teacher was I can't remember which one of them said what they said, but they were both working on the Bach G minor, and one of them played it in studio class, and the other, and these are two great violinists. Ben Beilman was one, and Nikki Chewy was the other. I just don't remember who said what, but one of them played, and I always go around the studio and ask people to make comments, see if they're really listening for the right thing. And the other said, "Wow, I'm studying the same piece, and I don't play in anything like that." And I felt so satisfied that I had achieved my goal, which is to make them better versions of themselves. Of course, sometimes you want to lead them in a certain direction, but you just have to take what they have and make it better. So teaching is exhausting because I did study with Galamian for a little while, but when you first studied with Galamian, you did all the same things that the rest of the students did, and it never sat well with me. I was frustrated, and I I didn't. I thought that I wanted to make it sound like me. And so he would assign a piece, and then he would say, such and such, just say this, go get the music and copy all the fingerings and bowings. And so I was like, oh, well, what if I want to do something different from what's his name? And that just wasn't an option. I think if I had stayed with him for a number of years, it might have become an option. He was a great teacher for a lot of people. It just didn't fit me quite the way that I wanted. And I wanted to study more about the score and the music and my individuality. And so I switched very early on to Shumsky, and it was the best move I ever made. So I think for me, I teach in the Shumsky mode, which is to pay individual attention to each student. And it's important, I think, for me to do that. It's tiring because you have to really think very hard as a teacher, but that's my goal anyway.
Yeah, can you say more about how we look at the same black and white markings and symbols on the page, but we can come up with very different ideas and thoughts about what that actually means and how we want it to sound and so forth? What does one do to arrive at that place?
I think sometimes it depends on the composer. So let's say a kid is studying Schubert or Beethoven or that 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 kind of style, and sometimes those composers might have some awkward passages or awkward phrases. And what I don't allow is for a student to start studying a piece by changing all the bowings to something that's easier or more convenient. So, and for instance, in the Schubert Fantasy, there are all those just incredibly difficult triplet passages, and there are osias of just playing eighth notes. So if a student brings in the eighth notes, I'm like, try to do what he wrote first. Let's try for a long time, and then little by little, we can take the things that are the most awkward and try to fix them and change them if necessary. But for me, I don't like when students uh, change bows because they don't have enough bow for something. But, that sounds like um, I'm very dogmatic about it. I'm not, but we start that way to just get what the composer had intended. So that's the first thing I think. It's the first sign of inadequacy in a student when they change things for their own convenience or make things easier. That's not what music's about. So let's say, okay, um, what's a good example? Slow movement of the Sibelius Concerto. There's that opening, which is so beautiful, melodic and all that, and then comes a tutti, and then comes the slurs where the two against the three, Ti da da ti da, and so if a student comes in and just ti da 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 da, I, I I don't allow them to do that. At least not at the beginning, because I think they they change the music by changing the slurs, because suddenly it becomes this kind of rhapsodic, easy, beautiful melody, or double stops. And what it actually represents at that place is struggle and pathos, and it's not easy and open. It's like torture in a good way. Torture sounds like a bad word, but that happens a lot in those kinds of concertos. It happens a lot in the Brahms concerto, where um, if you don't get the feeling of struggling first, then you're not going to get the right character for the passage or for the phrase. So first, try it the way that they wrote it, and then let's say you go. The better orchestras, you can probably do a lot of those original slurs, but you don't always play with the great orchestras, and a lot of times the conductor doesn't keep the orchestra down. So then, okay, change it. But not until you've tried and you've really gotten the feeling of the phrase.
You make decisions about bowings, and I'm wondering if it's the same for the left hand as well in terms of fingerings, that ultimately help you serve what it is that is supposed to, or that you think the composer intended for the moment, which means that the bowings and fingerings aren't necessarily about convenience and ease, but for the larger purpose of what you're trying to do with the phrase. Um, it seems to me that might be an engrossing and maybe even fun process
Hmm.
or creative process as well. I mean, is that something that you think about quite a bit, or you encourage your
Oh,
students
I
to
I
think about?
love
Or
I'm obsessed with fingerings, not because of technique, but because of what they do for a phrase and for a color. I remember hearing the great flutist Marcel Moïse talk about uh, the evenness of a phrase. And for me, when you change strings, that becomes not so even. So, in general, I try to keep slurs on one string if possible, just because I don't like to hear, and this is the way he would imitate the flutists that were playing for him, would be ah ooh, changing color like that, ah ooh, ah. And so of course that's not musical, but people don't think about it. They just play any kind of fingerings and bowings without tailoring them to what the music is about, or how the music should sound. So I am obsessed with fingerings. Um, Steve's in Palo Alto, and he he said he heard Alexi Kenny play something. And I really like Alexi. He's a beautiful musician. And his comment was, "You would love it. He uses the most beautiful fingerings." And it sounds so cold and technical, but it's so, for me, so crucial. Another one that I remember having discussions with Joey Silverstein um, when he was still around. and my colleague at Curtis, and we would talk about fingerings all the time. And he came to one of my concerts, and afterwards, his ultimate um, compliment to me was, "Wow, you've got some incredibly creative and beautiful fingerings." And I was like, "Oh, that makes me so happy." So yeah, but it's about the music, and it's usually makes things much more difficult. So, for instance, okay, I'm really getting nerdy now, but for years studying and playing the Kreutzer sonata, and the opening was like, oh, God, what? And nobody makes this sound right. And um, I finally came up, and it was not that long ago, maybe, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago or something. But, when you're as old as me, that's recent. So, so that opening chord, um, and then I can't, I don't have perfect pitch, but T, it does that because you change to the A and uh, A and D strings. So I came up with this fingering where you play the first chord, you're on the E string, and then he marks a forte with a diminuendo, right? So the next note, I change to the fourth position on the D and A. And then to me, that makes sense. It's incredibly difficult and rarely works, but it's so worth it when it works because to me, that makes the phrase sound, I imagine that that's the way he imagined it, you know? So sometimes well, it's usually the case, the most difficult fingerings are the best.
This is something obviously you decide in the practice room, and you sort of geek out about it, and you enjoy it, and you feel really good about it, and you test it out and so forth. When it comes to the performance, because my guess is it's not just the one fingering, and the fingering isn't the point, and there's a bunch of these things scattered throughout and bow stuff and so forth. What are you actually thinking about in the moment, or how do you keep your mind where it needs to be such that you're not just thinking about how to manipulate the left hand and the right arm to create these things? Do you know what I mean? Like, I'm wondering where your mind is at, I guess, in performance on stage when all this is happening.
Well, I've never been perfect. I'm not going to ever be perfect. And if that's all I worry about, that's all people are going to hear, that I'm trying not to make any mistakes. And of course, that's not the way you reach an audience by just, being, okay, this has to be technical. And that's how you start. First you start with a musical concept. You fit your fingerings and bowings to that musical concept and practice in a very technical way. But then ultimately, those are tools that you use to express yourself in a concert. And so, of course, because of the choices I make, they don't always work. And that's okay because if people want to hear something perfect, they can just, listen to a recording. So, I'm working with at the moment, and she has an unbelievable technique, and she's capable of playing everything perfectly. So sometimes I feel like she strives too much for that because she can. And so I try to my job with her is to be have more abandon and take more chances and forget about, there's certain things as you're playing that you have to think about technically, but basically what you want to do is reach, the fictitious woman in the 15th row or the 20th row. Steve and I always talk about Mrs. Ackerman. She's at the concert with her husband. They're a little hard of hearing, and you have to just be generous and express yourself so that Mrs. Ackerman goes home with a changed life.
I read something that you had said that I was hoping you might be able to elaborate further on, which I think is related to this. I mean, one thing that I read was, I think in reference to some competition, you said that competitors have the control to tell us judges what to focus on. And related to that, You also said, this is a quote, "I find that if you make a plan while playing, then you get less nervous because your mind does not have the chance to go to other places." I wonder if you could elaborate on that idea and what you meant by
Sure,
those things.
sure. Yeah, this goes along with my earlier training of thinking, Mischakoff thinking, and of course with Shumsky, he had such a supremely intellectual way of looking at the violin and music. Um, but it has to do also with nerves, with young students who have nerves, and everybody has nerves at some point in their lives. Some more suffer more than others. Um, but I think if you make a plan about what you're going to think about, sometimes it's something very simple, like I this string crossing is an up bow. This shift is a down bow. Just little things like that, sort of interspersed, that will make your performance more solid and more beautiful. If you plan to think about those things in a concert, your brain has a lot less opportunity to wander and to be subjected to the nerves. So I think a plan in a concert is really important. And of course, it's different with every student because some of them are not, if they're not musical, then that kind of technical plan is not as effective. But let's say they're solid enough technically that you can say, at this point, this is what you have to imagine in terms of the expression of the phrase. Make a story, imagine a beautiful place or a scary place or an experience in your life that, things like that you need to convey to students that have a solid technique but think too much about it or
Right.
depend too much on it. The thing is, you know, these days there's so many people that can play incredibly well. I mean, the general level of playing is so improved and so high that it's not enough. It was never enough, but now that there are more of them, it's really not enough.
I don't know if this is related to what you were just saying, but the great basketball coach Phil Jackson, coached the Bulls and the Lakers for many years. One thing that he said once is, not only is there more to life than basketball, there's a lot more to basketball than basketball. I'm wondering what comes to mind when you hear this, especially in context of the little that I know about Oscar Shumsky, is that he had other interests and passions and skills outside of music. And so those things maybe seemed aligned. And I was just wondering what your thoughts were about the Phil Jackson quote.
Well, I do, as you know, I have a passion for my hobby, which is that my dogs. I don't know if you can see them. It's a hobby that I just really love, and I show them, and I've trained them for hunting and obedience, and they're just a real focus, and it's wonderful, and it's so removed. And sometimes I play the national anthem at dog shows, and then people know what I do to pay for the kibble. But I meet people that I have no idea what they do, and I don't really care because we share this passion for dogs. So I think it's healthy to have any kind of hobby, whether it's reading or hiking or cooking or whatever, something that takes you completely away from music, because then when you go back to it, it's so much more special than if you're just tunnel visioned about it all day long. So I do believe it's really important. Sometimes if I feel like a student is in a rut or depressed about something, I'll just invite them for the morning walk with the dogs in Philly, down the river. So things like that, I do think it's important. Um, I think we can't be just thinking about one thing all the time.
I'm also guessing, I wonder if there are things that you learn in one performance domain that you don't necessarily immediately recognize as being useful to your primary or other performance domain, but at some point you realize how much you've learned by being involved in trying to learn or get better at something else. And I'm wondering if there are specific examples you can think of with your experiences with the dog showing, breeding, and so forth. I mean, one thing that came to mind is I only learned about this because when I was talking to Steve, he mentioned that you were initially less comfortable showing the dogs, but then became more comfortable over time. And so I'm wondering if you can say more about that, perhaps.
Well, it's just like everything else. I mean, you might have talent at something, but you have to practice it to get good. And I felt at first, and Steve's the one that first went in the show ring. And I just watched and took videos and pictures, and I knew I wanted to do it, but I wasn't ready to take the plunge. So I took some classes and I practiced and I got better and I really enjoyed it. And it's just like everything else. It requires discipline and repetition and practice and a brain thinking about it, you know. And what I love about showing dogs is that is similar to violin playing and teaching violin students is that each dog is an individual, and some of them require a heavy hand, and some require simply positive reinforcement and encouragement. So you have to get inside the brain of a dog just like a student. So that's a really that's that really carries over to both things. Just treating each one as an individual. I have an 11-year-old and a 6-year-old, and they're mother and daughter, but completely different. So, the kind of discipline it might take to get one of them to do something doesn't work on the other. One of them's happy all day long. One of them is loving and sweet, but a little too much of a thinker. Well, like, what's happening there? And the other one's like, life is great. So I love having the life is great one because it's like a life lesson. You know, she wakes up happy. She's happy all day long. She goes to sleep happy. Same thing the next day. And I was like, you just want to be like that, you know? The mother is a show dog. She's a retired show dog, and she was one of the top in the country when she was campaigning. And the second one, the daughter, oh, I just loved her, but we weren't supposed to keep her. And make a long story short, I cried, and Steve let me keep her. And so here she is, and I loved her from the second she was born. I could tell right away um, she was just a real positive animal. Anyway, so her bite went off when she was 4 months old, and while it's not a disqualification, it's really almost impossible to make a champion out of a dog with a bad bite. So I said, okay, we're gonna have to do some other stuff. So I noticed she was very into hunting, and so I started training myself and her um, to be a hunter. And of course, she had so much natural instinct that it didn't take that much. And then when it got past, I got the lowest title you can get as a hunter, which is called junior hunter. Then when it was time for her to, obviously she had a lot more ability than I had, so I sent her to my friend in Colorado, and she passed the middle level, which is senior hunter, and just soared right up to master hunter. And she has one of the most coveted titles that Vizslas, this is the breed I have, a Hungarian hunting dog, can get, which is a master hunter. So I just sort of I had to adjust my thinking because my plan for her was to be a great show dog, especially with her fun attitude. But that was not to be. So instead, she became a great hunter.
It sounds like somewhat reflective of what I think I've heard you say in other interviews about building a career or navigating a career, which is to be open and flexible to things that you might not have planned or
A
expected.
great
But
analogy. Yep.
end up becoming quite meaningful if you're
Yep.
open to them.
I think having goals is only good for musical goals, to be the best you can, to be, to strive to be a great musician. That's a great goal. But a career goal, I don't think those are healthy. Eh, First of all, you might have one that's out of reach, and if you never reach that, it might be a source of frustration instead of. So, I mean, the things that came along in my life were not, some people thought I should be a soloist. Some people thought, okay, you're going to be a chamber music player. And then, but all this stuff happened on the side that I didn't expect. And if I had not taken advantage of those things that presented themselves, I, I, I would have had a very different life if I had just thought, okay, I want to do this.
I think sometimes it takes some courage to explore or grab hold of some of these things that peek their way into our lives, and we're not sure if that's what we should be grabbing onto or not. I mean, but in hindsight, everything makes sense. But in the moment, do you have ways of making those decisions for yourself or deciding, is this something that I grab onto, or is there any uncertainty, or do you just kind of know immediately that, oh, I want to grab this?
Oh, I think there's always doubt. If you don't have doubt, that means you're not really seeing the whole picture. But I think being open to trying things is really important in your career, in the way you play, in the way you study. Um, just a stupid example is I have a trick of how to play fifths that I share with anybody who's willing to listen. Um, and that was out of growing up and playing fifths out of tune, and I was like, oh, I gotta do this. I gotta, and it just made me crazy. There's got to be a way to do this better. So I learned how to manipulate my strings so that the strings are closer together. So using another finger to bring the strings together and then planting the finger on the fifth in question. And that is I mean, that works so well that almost everybody that tries it immediately is like they had this aha moment. And that's like my signature thing that I love to share because and it came out of a frustration of my own of like I'm getting sick of playing fifths out of tune. And of course in Bach, it's like it's really, really important. I also feel like I don't want to get too technical, but I think that people play too much on their tippy tips. And your tippy tip, and this is a Mischakoff thing too. He used to always teach us to play on the flat of the finger. And the tippy tip has the least meat and creates the most tension. And when you have tension, you play out of tune and you get injured. To me, it's a no-brainer. But I don't know why it takes people so long to admit it and then fix it. It's frustrating to me. And so I'm always teaching, this kind of position and not this. And that is very helpful for sound, for intonation, and for keeping yourself from getting injured after all.
Yeah.
And kind of curling of the fingers takes muscles and and you know th- having a very loose hand where you don't really feel like bones or anything. It's just like cartilage, I think is so much healthier.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. One last question before you take off. If you only had, and I'm sure the answer varies depending on what's going on in your life, but if you only had 20 minutes to practice, what would you do, or what would you advise a
Oh,
student to do?
I totally believe it. It really, oh, sorry. It really angers me when people say, well, I just don't have time to practice. I just had, 20 minutes. I had a half hour. It was no point. That's not true. You can learn anything. You can learn something really useful in a very short amount of time. But what that is, I'm not sure I could generalize exactly what it is, but if I would probably say in a piece that you're playing and you're having trouble in a certain place, just isolate that place, make it very small, just a few. That's another practice technique is starting with two notes, adding the previous note, adding the next note, just one by one adding until but not adding until those two notes feel good or those three notes feel good. So, and then when you're really solid, adding another note. So that's something you can do with any passage. So, I would probably sometimes, what else is in my music? We talked earlier about the markings in my music. I have a lot of X's or stars. Depends. X's are, yeah, a little problematic. Stars are like, you need to practice this. Working from an iPad is really useful because you can use different colors for different things. So I have a lot of X's and stars in my, at the end of lines that I need to look at.
Related to that, I mean, how much time do you spend actually planning what you're going to do in the practice room?
That's a good question. I'm not sure exactly how much time, but a good bit. It goes along with, thinking and planning. So yeah, I'll spend a good amount of time. Like I'll probably practice after this because I have the rest of my day is free fantastically. So I can spread out the practicing. So I'll do a couple hours and then I'll do something else, maybe take a hike with the dogs and then go back maybe. For instance, I have a certain number of pieces that I'm preparing. So I'll I'll yesterday I did like two movements of a piece, so I'll do the other two movements. So I've already started thinking about how I'm gonna attack those movements. And then later I'll do something else. So I think planning is really important. I remember, okay, I have to tell you one more story. Um or I don't know how many more stories. But anyway, this one's a good one because um I was teaching Ben Beilman, who's just a phenomenal musician and player. He studied with me 5 years at Curtis. And we were preparing him for the Indianapolis competition. This is many years ago. And I thought he should do another competition ahead of it to get experience. So he did Montreal. And it was a little more than just a preparation because he won. Okay, so now he has all these wonderful opportunities from winning the Montreal competition. And so one time they came to him and they asked him to do all 24 caprices in a concert, Paganini. And so he came to his next lesson and he goes, ha ha, you're not going to believe this, but they want me to play a recital of all 24 caprices. Isn't that hysterical? I would never do that. I'm not doing that. That's not my thing. And he was at that time already a thinker and a beautiful musician. And that was where his focus was. He had a decent technique, but it wasn't his main goal. So I looked at him and I said, I think it's a great idea. Let's do it. We'll be really methodical. And so I said, make a schedule. This week you're gonna do this. Okay, so the first four, the first day, and then the next four, and then the next day after that, the next four, but review the first set. And so we made a really a careful plan of how to learn this monstrosity of a project. And he did it. He was so diligent and so smart in the way he prepared. He did it, and it was the best thing. It took his technique from here to just limitless. It was really great. So if a student is preparing for a competition and they have a lot of repertoire to plan or to practice, I'll ask them to write it out in a book. and um, plan exactly the goal for that day. This piece, the next day is another piece or two pieces. Review this, so that you're really not just taking the fiddle out and being overwhelmed by having to play 12 pieces at once. I hate competitions, but I love how they make people practice. I was talking to Arnold Steinhardt, who's my next door neighbor here. He's wonderful. We were hiking with the dogs the other day. His dogs, Banksy, and my dogs are really good buddies. Anyway, we were talking about competitions, and of course he has had the same he has the same feeling, and he recalled when he was preparing for the Queen Elizabeth, he already had his position, I think, assistant concertmaster of the Cleveland Orchestra, and he just asked Zell if he could have this time off to do the competition. I think he had already won Leventritt and all that, and they allowed him to do it, and he said it was the best thing because he just practiced so hard, and he was already in the orchestra, so he would practice from, I think he said 10 to 2, 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. because, he had a concert. He said it was the best thing ever because it really shored up his violin playing.